All right, so the next category, and which is the last category, is orders. Orders. And the reason why I use orders is, I don't know, I have this funny thing here. I didn't know who again. I had called everyone I thought about that could exist in an organization, in an IT organization, you know? So I had orders there. We see people talking about practices without the principles. I see people talking about the principles without the practices. This is critically important, and I stress it. The principles and the practices go hand in hand. They're immutable. You cannot separate it. I wrote a comment. I wrote a post on LinkedIn some years back, and it was centered about stringing together a bunch of agile teams doesn't necessarily make them agile. You have to have the right principles to change the mindset, and then have the right practices to drive the change. One of my early engagements in 2014 was with Wood Forest National Bank. And in Wood Forest National Bank, one of the things they were trying to do was to drive the principles without the practices. So they hired all the Scrum Masters, and they just allowed us to go into the teams, and we were excited. We're preaching the gospel of Agile. So we were talking about Agile. We were, really excited and passionate about Agile. But they lack the practices. They lack the technological framework to drive those principles. For example, we talked about, we could do testing in a different way. Hey, we want to release quickly. We want to ensure that releases, we want to have a proper naming convention for our releases. But they didn't have the required releases documentations to actually even release at all, to even release on time. The pipelines were not all bad. There was really nothing to help encourage the deliveries and the releases that we were preaching. The teams were all preaching. The Scrum Masters were preaching with the teams.
Excuse me.
Please.
Sorry to disturb you. Can you please give some examples of the practices? What do you mean by practices? How those practices, if followed properly, they can, improvise or lead the changes effectively in an organization?
Yeah, thank you, Atul. So yes, and I'm glad you asked that. I'm really glad you asked that. So there's some practices, like I was kind of referencing some of those examples right now. For example, releases, right? When you Scrum Masters are going talking about, hey, this is how we want to release. Hey, let's come up with a naming convention, and let's put all your bundle up all your epics and your stories, assign them to this release, and then that's basic, right? That's good practices. That's like teaching the principles on how to show a start date and end date for our releases. But if you don't have the continuous pipeline, if you don't have the technological framework from an organizational standpoint to drive to those releases, you cannot even release. For example, that's just one of the environment. Testing environment. Hey, if your definition of done as a Scrum Master principles, you're telling the team, hey, we need to create a definition of done. We need to create a definition of ready. And these are some of the things that we want. We want to ensure that we have acceptance criteria. We want to ensure we do peer programming, for example. We want to ensure we do some of all these great technical capabilities on this project, on this team. But then the organization itself don't even have the practices that supports the principles. Hey, they don't even have an environment for testing, for example, or the testing environment is outsourced to a third-party firm or to an organization to help with the testing. How do you even help the team when you, as Scrum Master, you're preaching, hey, let's have definition of done. Let's have multiple environments. Let's have on-the-spot testing, maybe functional testing, maybe regressional testing, and then maybe the testing is even sourced out to another third-party firm to do the testing. So that's a clear example of we Scrum Masters sometimes trying to drive the principles and the underlying practices are missing. And sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, it could even be the other way. Sometimes the practices are there, but then we don't have the people to drive the principles. And you know what? Some of the principles is because when they say something to us, we don't have the right words to say back. So we try to drive the changes, and our changes, sometimes we're too timid to even be a change agent. So the principle space is missing. So the practices could be there and the principles is out of the way. Sometimes it's the principle that is there, we're preaching agile, we're telling them about the mindset, how we need to change, the minimum viable product, for example. This is how we need to work. We need to work, even if we don't have the full requirements, we're going to potentially work on something that represents value to our stakeholders, functionality that represents value to our stakeholders. But if you're preaching all that and the practices is missing, there's already an appreciable disconnect already there somewhere. So the whole concept is sometimes we hear people tell us things and